Thanks. So thank you all. Thank you for joining us for our lunch with Jeff Bellin. He's here to give a book talk about his book, Mass Incarceration Nation. Some of you may know Professor Bellin from William & Mary because I and others who teach evidence here at Duke use Jeff Bellin's evidence case book now. But we're here to learn more about Professor Bellin's most recent one of his 6 books called Mass Incarceration Nation. And I'm especially excited because I had read earlier drafts of this and saw the project as it was taking shape. It reflects some of the very best qualities of Professor Bellin's work. Professor Bellin is balanced, careful, understands the system from the ground, was a former prosecutor in AUSA in Washington, D.C., teaches evidence, which is a close-to-the-ground class, as well as other criminal procedure classes. And in a big picture, the book is a response to sort of single problem, single solution theories of mass incarceration and points the way to the complexity of the problem. I kind of think mass incarceration would not be as mass and big as it is if there were simple solutions. And in general, Professor Bellin's going to, we have some slides here, we have the cover of the book, and he's going to introduce some of the main findings and themes. But think of questions you want to ask. We're going to kind of stop halfway for Q&A to talk more about this. And thank you all for being here. Let's welcome Professor Bellin.
Great, thank you, Brandon. It's a real treat to present the book here because you can see two of my favorite legal academics are here with us both, who've been tremendously supportive throughout my career. And then thanks in addition for inviting me down here, Brandon, for your wonderful center. So I'll give you a warning at the outset. So Brandon said I have a lot of books, but this is my only book that has an actual publisher, and even that was a challenge. I tried to, when I was writing the book, I saw it as the goal was to reach kind of a broad audience, so not just an academic audience. And so I tried to sell it to kind of popular press editors. And the response, this is why this is a warning, that I got from them was like, it's not entertaining enough, right? There's not enough like a hook to your explanation of mass incarceration, because my explanation was like it's complicated, like it's more complicated. And so some of the things that editors, you have to get an agent to get a popular press, so some of the things that agents would say to me were like, they've like seared into my brain because I was so frustrated. But one of the agents said to me that nuance doesn't sell. And so, like, that's true, but, like, I can't just take out, like, basically, and then they were very open to, I could change the book. So there's a book at the end, or a chapter at the end, that's like, we should basically do away with the entire federal law enforcement apparatus, or most of it. It says abolish most of that, right? So, like, this agent was like, what we could do? Make that your book. Like, just do that as your book. And I was like, but that's not like the story of mass incarceration. It's just like one tiny piece. He's like, but that will sell, right? That will sell. So what happened was I had to give up on the popular press to write the book that was more true to like what's actually happening in terms of mass incarceration. And I tell you that story so that you'll see there will be less entertainment value, but more actual reality, like more of what's actually going on. But I also think there's interesting, and I've toyed with the idea, and I think, again, no one will publish this, of like writing something up about how hard it is to share with a broad audience any kind of complex explanation for events. And like, I think as you look at books that are out there, and this is what happens when I see them, you can see the pressure that was put on the author to kind of simplify and jazz up the theme, make it more, like, I guess, make it sell. And so in a way, like what that does to the public discussion. But anyway, you all are here, so you're the last people I need to tell you this, so you came anyway. And so I'll just walk through kind of where I see mass incarceration, kind of what I think is different about my approach to what happened and what people are missing and things like that. And I think one of the ways to read kind of my take on this is that my background is kind of unusual in that I was a prosecutor, but not really a federal prosecutor. So in Washington, D.C., where everything is state, and so basically like a state-level prosecutor. And but then I worked for the California Courts of Appeal and did a lot of criminal cases there as well. And then I worked as a professor when I first started in Dallas at SMU, then moving to William & Mary, where I started teaching a seminar in mass incarceration. And I think having this perspective of having seen the way the system works in all these different places, so it's different in each state. Like one of the key things that I talk about in the book is how different the different systems are that give us mass incarceration. And then it's different in each place you are. So like you see it at the trial level, see it at the appeals court level, and then obviously see it in California, see it in Texas, see it in Virginia. It's different everywhere, and so that's like where I come from in terms of, well, there's a lot of nuance here. Like it's very hard to say this is the thing that causes mass incarceration, because the thing is different, not just each state, but even within the state and within each office in the state and things like that. So I think being able to have both having taught it as a seminar, as like a big picture perspective, but also having been in the trenches, kind of seeing what's actually happening, gives me a unique perspective to tell this story, but one that no one is interested in except for you guys. All right, so let's talk through kind of where I went. Oh, the other thing I try to do, I think if you're speaking, and you guys appreciate this, if you're speaking about criminal justice stuff in America today, I think, unless you have numbers, you're not going to change anyone's mind. Like that's the only thing left that will actually change someone's mind. So if it's just like rhetoric or powerful words, like that'll impress the people that already agree with you and just have no effect, or probably push away people that don't. All right, so this is, like I said, is where we are, really where we were in 2019, and this is the stats that people have heard a lot. We were the highest rate of incarceration and also the highest number. And then you can see just some other countries, right, that were, which is really remarkable that the United States had more people incarcerated than any other country in the world, and this was for a long time, right, up until 2019. And I think rate is probably the fairest way to assess this. So 629 per 100,000 people in the general population. You'll see different rates because people use different numbers, so they'll be like per adults or per, because like mostly adults are the ones in incarceration, but this is like per actual 100,000 people. If you've seen other rates. All right, so, and then the other thing, one of the key things I try to point out in the book is, there's a temptation to be like, well, this is a southern problem, or it's like a problem in red states or something, right? But the truth is, it's everywhere a problem. And so I illustrate that by showing the change between the 70s, which is kind of before we started on mass incarceration, and 2019, and the percent change. And so one big change was the federal system, right? Almost 500% change. Increase, Texas, obviously, but California, right? So California's supposed to be a progressive state, and so it's, it's like kind of defeats the narrative that it's just kind of one location, certainly not in the South, Ohio. And then even if you just say, like, so these are the top ones. And New York, by the way, kind of started early on reducing. So if you picked a different day, 2018, 2017, you could make that number higher too. But see, this is why it's an academic press book and not a popular press book. Because even though I know that, I can make these numbers better by just switching it another day, I didn't do it because I was like, well, that's the right date to use, even if the New York number doesn't jump out at you. Okay, so and then all the others, right, that's all the other states, high as well. And then, so here's what happened, like around in the 70s, we started kind of change things that I'm going to talk about, and that sent us up to 2.3 people incarcerated, so that's higher than 2019, because we started going down around 2008, and I'll talk about this in a second, the trend has continued. But what's really significant is not the kind of slight decrease at the end, but the ramping up from 1980 to 2008. And then, I describe it as now, like we're just kind of on a plateau. It's not like suddenly we're coming down the other end. We're just kind of went up really high, and while there's some decrease now, we're basically stuck at this plateau of mass incarceration. But there is change, right? So one of the interesting things that's changed, if you look at the 2020, it's always a lag, so there's no numbers more than 2020. But if you look at the 2020 numbers, now the rate, we're not at the highest rate of incarceration in the world. There are some smaller countries that have passed us. And I actually think while the China number, the number is lower, they actually don't reveal a lot of information. So there's actually tons of people in China that are also incarcerated that aren't captured here. Also, they execute lots of people. So even the number, I think we probably fairly aren't number one anymore. But still, like this is still way too high. And one of the ways I talk about that is like historically, our number wasn't anywhere like that. And if you look at like peer countries like UK, right, like 137 per 100,000. So like while there has been progress, and I think just the same point, right, like I'm not going to pretend there's no progress to make the book seem more important. There has been some progress, but it's the way I think of it is we kind of jumped to this high point and went down a little bit, and now we're kind of stuck at that still very high incarceration number. The other good kind of thing that's improved is the racial disproportion of incarceration has gotten a lot better since the peak of mass incarceration. So that's another thing that's improving over time, and so that's interesting to see if that trend continues. But that's worth noting. And then finally, I joke about this. So like I have Twitter, and I tweet things like this. This is, like more people will see this tweet now than when I tweeted it on Twitter. Just like putting it in my presentation is the best way to get my Twitter out there. So I increased it. But here's the point. Like, so I said we've gone down a little bit in the last couple of years, but then last one that came out, we've gone up, right? So this is what I'm saying. Like, I don't think it's like, oh, there was mass incarceration and now it's over and now we're going down. I think what happened is we went up really high. There were kind of some awareness and some slight changes in policies, but also like crime went way down, so that like also put pressure to reduce incarceration. And now like the things you start to see, so there was a huge change with COVID, and so that's kind of gone away, like law enforcement's back to normal. And then also there's this kind of backlash already to the modest reforms we've had. And so like I wouldn't be surprised if we just kind of go back up, right? Or mostly probably just stay around where we are, but it's certainly not a problem that's ended. Okay, and so then like the rest of the talk is going to be primarily on like how this happened. And like you might say, well, it's just history. But the way I frame this in the book is I think it's important if we can understand what happened, that's important to figure out how we get back to where we were, right? Like, so if, as I talked about, these are changes we can actually see, we can diagnose what happened with mass incarceration, and even if it's really complicated, right, see what changed, and then a way to get back to where we were is to just change those things back, right? So that's kind of how I frame. Like, why is the history important? Because we kind of see what we did that caused this problem, and that would at least be part of our way of solving it, of like stopping doing those things. Especially because think like how hard it is to change things that aren't in our control. So you're trying to solve the problem of like climate change or the pandemic, right? These are really hard problems to solve because we don't control all the variables. But if you can show, like, here's how we went from, because in the 70s we had incarceration rates that were the same as European countries, way lower than what we've got now. You can see we can go back to there. We've done that before. So basically all the changes, we changed what we were doing policy-wise. We can kind of undo those changes. We would go back to what we were for the like as far as we keep records. Before the 60s, the incarceration rate was down, like it shows there, in like slightly over, in between 100 and 200, say, for 100,000. Okay, so how do we get there? You can see so the way I describe this in the book, the one thing that like seems like you can say this is the starting point was there was a crime surge in the 70s, and you can see it, like I don't believe in crime data, basically that period, except for homicides. I think that's reliably captured, and I'm like possibly will believe in car theft stats because people are like forced to kind of report car thefts either for their insurance or because they start getting tickets and they're like, well, that wasn't me, so I will reluctantly now tell you that my car was stolen. Okay, so I think those stats are good, and so I'm very skeptical of crime data generally, but I do believe in homicide data because everyone reports homicides, and police can't really fudge that people are dead. And you can actually verify them with CDC numbers too, so you don't have to just rely on the police. And so, so it looks like there was a real crime spike in the 70s. It's reflected in the homicide numbers, and a very significant jump. And I don't like that's not the cause of mass incarceration. What is the cause of is a change in our policy. And so there was this like sense of there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of things that went into that. But one of the things was actually there being a lot of crime. You look like New York City. There were thousands of murders in New York City. So now we're fighting about like did crime go up in New York City, did crime go down because it went like from 400 to 420. But like in the early 90s, there were like 3,000 homicides in New York City. So there's a very real change. And what did that mean? It meant that politicians could come out with like, let's be tough on crime, and that was popular in the Congress. If you weren't tough on crime, it was unpopular. And the key thing, if you understand, and this audience will, to understand how policy works in the United States is it's kind of hard for anything big to change as long as one party is against it, right? And because then it won't go everywhere because of the states that are in control of the one party won't do it, and it will change over time because like, well, this Republican will have it, but then once it's a Democrat, changes back. But the thing that happened in this country in the 70s was the Republicans started with like, they're going to be super tough on crime with Nixon and all this, but the Democrats kind of, while they initially were like, well, maybe let's think about that, decided at some point, no, let's go, we'll just match the Republicans. We'll also be tough on crime. And you can find it's kind of interesting because Biden is stuck around, but certainly like before Biden, Bill Clinton was the example, as I talked about in the book, as governor of Arkansas, he had pardoned a bunch of people in his first term, and then lost the second term. And part of why he lost was possibly was he was hit with these ads about he was soft on crime. And then you can see, like, when he got reelected as Arkansas governor, he pardoned basically no one. And then when he became president, he was kind of a tough on crime Democrat, this new Democrat. And then you can see that also with Joe Biden. But you can see it all throughout the spectrum. I talk about Ted Kennedy in the book, who's like a prominent liberal and made this like kind of one of his big issues. Like, I'm going to make tough on crime one of my issues. And so what matters about that is if you have both the Democrats and the Republicans saying, we're going to be tough on crime, there's like no one left to be like, no, like let's not do that, right? In the United States, it's two parties, and if both parties agree on something, that's what's going to happen, right? And so this is like, this is just a thought I have. I think a lot of times the parties get excited about something and they kind of pass symbolic legislation. It doesn't really change anything. And I think in a way it matters. If you look at what they changed, it was very sophisticated. And I think why? Because a lot of the people that were legislators had also been prosecutors or at least lawyers. And so they did a lot of like clever things to make sure that they didn't just pass a law that said like the sentence goes up, but they, I'll show you some of the slides on this, like they thought through like all the different ways that might not impact someone. So it's that like the ways that someone might commit a crime and then not end up with a long sentence, and they try to like close all those doors. And they did it effectively. So it wasn't just like rhetorically passing laws that were tough on crime, but actually like making sure people were serving longer sentences, and that's what happened. And so in a sense, it's really hard to puzzle out with the data again, but it's because it's so important. People have done a lot of sophisticated analysis of sentence lengths. The reason it's hard to figure out is because the way the system used to be was you could get a long-sounding sentence. So you get, like, you commit a robbery in California in 1970, you get sentenced to, like, 1 year to 40, or something like that, like these kind of long, indeterminate sentences. And so then if you compare that sentence to, like, someone getting 10 years, in 2010, you might say, like, oh, well, it's actually less serious because it was 1 year to 40. But what really matters is, like, how long did the person serve? And so what was happening is you get the 1 to 40 in California in 1970, but you'd serve 1 or less, right? And then now you'd get it and serve 5 years. And so this actual time served increases. You can't just look at what the judges are saying. So when you do all that and you figure out kind of what was happening, we see that the sentence lengths change. And this is what I was saying, like this is so significant. Like you have to do so many things to make this happen. So you have to kind of, one thing is like change the judges you're appointing, right? Because they have some discretion in sentences, change who the prosecutors are, change the laws to increase the sentence lengths. They did a lot of things to make it easier to get convictions, and that pushes things up in plea bargaining and stuff like that. And then here's the last piece of this. The other thing they did was they made it like really hard to get parole, right? And this is the sophistication I was talking about. Like they could have just said, let's have higher sentences, and the judges would have like been imposing higher sentences, and then you could have a parole board, which is the way the system was in the 70s. The real decider of sentencing in the 70s was these parole boards, and so whatever your sentence was, you were kind of placeholder sentences, and then depending on how you did in incarceration plus whatever other variables the parole board was considering, they would decide how long you were in. And it used to be, like you see in 1990 in Texas, right? 78% of people are getting out on parole early, and then these changes start happening, and now we're down to 20% or something, right? Like and that, is below the radar. You don't hear a lot of people talking about parole as what's going on with mass incarceration, but this is a huge factor in like, well, why are more people in prison for longer? It's not just prosecutors and judges, it's parole boards. Now when your parole application comes up, they're just saying no. And they're saying no more often and longer. And this is Texas where they kept parole. It's actually interesting, in Texas, parole is in the Constitution. You have like constitutional right to parole. And so they had to keep parole. But keeping parole can mean different things, right? So they can, and this is what they did, they appoint different people to the parole board. It used to be like, who wanted to be on a parole board? It was like criminologists, sociologists, like people like us, right? Who were just interested in data and stuff. And then it became like a political thing. And one of the things that's interesting, I have to drag this out of Texas. They have a good open records thing, but it's so hard. But one of the interesting things they were doing in their parole board reports was they would publish the rate for each person on their votes. And so you could see, like, was this parole board person letting people out or not? And the politics of the time were the less people you let out, the more likely you get reappointed or appointed to the parole board and stuff like that. And so, this is just the complexity, right? It's all these things happening at once. So in some states, they just were getting rid of parole entirely. So there were just no one getting out on parole. Then you don't have to worry about this. In other states, they kept parole, but they made it so many fewer people were getting out on parole. And then they changed the people on the parole board so that when people came up, no one was getting out. So I talk about in the book, like California is a great example of these working together. In California, they got rid of parole for mostly all crimes, and then, but except for life, if you get a life sentence in California, you could be eligible for parole, and so those were still coming up. But then the people that were deciding those weren't letting anyone out, and so there's two things happening at once, right? One, the law making no one eligible for parole almost, and then the other being the people that were still eligible for parole. That parole board was just not letting them out, and so you have these crazy numbers. If you look at the California numbers, like 0.5% approval for parole release over this period. And so it's those things working together. So it's like what's going on. It's like not just as a parole, but it's different pieces of the parole equation are happening differently. And then California is even worse than that. You can believe so they got rid of early release on parole, but then they had an idea that we'll still have parole. It will just be like you serve your whole sentence, and then we'll give you something called parole, which is like in the federal system they did this with supervised release. The federal also got rid of parole, and they added on supervision at the end. And so, and that's important because then people were getting sent back on parole violations, even though they weren't being released early. So the idea of parole is supposed to be you get out early, but you're under supervision. So you're kind of like still in prison, but you're out. And so that's why they're watching you closely. But in California, in the federal system, they actually stopped letting you out early and still added on supervision at the end. And the supervision meant that you would now be, failing your drug test or not showing up, and they could revoke you on parole or in the federal system supervised release. And what's the point of that? And this is something I'm going to talk about. It just makes it easy to send someone to prison on parole violations, on supervised release violations. And one of the things that happens is as crime goes down, as I talked about, there's a crime spike, but then crime goes down, but we're still sending about the same number of people to prison. And how is that happening? What happens is the resources shift to just where they're easiest. And so where it's easiest to put people in prison, and one of the easiest things to do versus going through a trial, right? It's much easier to use parole revocations than to go through the process of even plea bargaining and stuff like that. And it's just fascinating. I know too much because there's just too many sides. But the California, when they passed what I was saying, to make the parole on the end, the parole officers were like, "Hey, guess what's great about us? We bypass all of the process. We can put people in prison without any process." And so California, it's not even a judge, it's nobody. It's just the parole person, the parole officer is you go to prison. That's the process you get. That's a little exaggerated. But basically, that's what it's like. And that's how it was sold. It wasn't hidden. So when I got this, I was like, oh, it's the coolest piece of information ever, but because I'm jaded, right? So it's really kind of dark and sad. All right, so, to understand, so that's the sentence part of it, the sentence length. But also important is the amount of people being convicted. And this is to illustrate the relation between all the parts of the system, right? Like Brandon said at the beginning, my thing is it's all the pieces of the system working together. You want to understand any phenomenon here, you have to understand how all the pieces work together, otherwise you're going to miss what's really going on. And so it's not just arrests, and it's not just charges, and it's not just judges convicting people, and the sentences, actually all the things working together. And one way you can see that is if you look at arrests versus convictions. And so here, and this is the point of this, is to show how police arrests matter, right? It's not just the prosecutors, not just the judges. And so you can see kind of these track for certain offenses. So for homicides, it makes perfect sense, right? As homicide arrests go up, and that's with the spike that I was talking about, the prosecutions go up, and then when they come down, the prosecutions go down, and so that's why there's more or less convictions over time. And that makes sense, right? If police arrest someone for homicide, it makes sense that the prosecutor can charge that person for homicide, and there's a gap, right? Some of those are cases the prosecutors have been running the evidence, or acquittals and things like that. But there's going to be this track. If you're arrested for homicide, your case is going to court, right? Because that's serious, and people aren't going to just drop that. And then, so that tracks. But let's talk about drugs next. It didn't have to be true for drugs. So one of the key changes that happened in the, like what I said, there's like two things that happen. One is crime goes up, and so there's more like enforcement of that. But also the resources, once crime goes down, the resources shift to like, what can we do when there's not a burglary, when there's not a robbery to go investigate? It's like drug stings and stuff like that. So that's what the police start doing. And so there's tons more drug arrests, like more than any other change in terms of arrests is drug arrests. So tons more drug arrests are coming into the system. And you can see that in the bottom graph here. And the convictions just track the arrest. And that didn't have to happen. Like prosecutors could have said, well, we're not really here for drug cases. Like that's not why we're doing this. And then judges could have said, well, I'm not going to sentence people severely for drug cases. And like, or just like, you know, and that would trickle down into pleas and stuff like that. But no, like the system just absorbed things. So as the police arrested more people for drug offenses, the prosecutors charged the higher number of drug cases, and that resulted in a higher number of convictions. And so it just tracked as well. The other interesting things are like two things, like offense-wise, that really changed between the 70s and the late 2000s. One is drugs. The other is assaults. And assaults is kind of more interesting and something people don't talk about because it's like difficult to talk about. But and there you can see there's like less matching, but it does match, and that arrests go way up for assaults, and these are aggravated assaults, like felony assaults, and convictions kind of go up as well. But notice there's like huge gap there, and what's that? That's because it's kind of harder to get convictions in cases like that, and that's something I'll touch on also, because if you think about like typical drug arrest and conviction, it's like a police officer who sees someone sell drugs and goes and testifies about that. It's, as a former prosecutor, it's just easy to do that case, easy to get a conviction. The aggravated assault, that's like someone with domestic violence or someone hurt someone in a bar or something like that. Those are difficult cases to prosecute and to succeed because the civilian witnesses, right, not the police officer, may not want to go forward. There's some story, sometimes you can't figure out, is this really the person that did it, all of that. And so that tracks why you have like this huge gap between arrests and convictions, but it's pulling, like the more arrests is pulling the convictions up, but there's still a lot of kind of chaos in the actual processing of the cases. All right, let's see what we have next. Okay, so this is the point I was making about this shift between, like at first, what happens is like, oh no, there's more crime. Both parties want to be tough on crime. They pass more severe laws. They funnel resources. More police officers are hired. More prosecutors. The people that are doing these jobs now are being vetted to make sure they're tough on crime, judges, all that stuff. And so that's the first thing that happens. And at first, what you can see is like, rape prosecutions are going up and people are getting longer sentences. Homicide prosecutions are going up, people are getting longer sentences. And then at some point, crime starts going down. You see, so that like one of the interesting things here, the top right chart. So like we can actually figure out how many aggravated assaults there actually are because there's a huge survey of just people like, have you been victimized by crime? And they ask them what crimes. And so from that, you can see that over this period, while aggravated assaults had gone really high, they're just plummeting. So crime is going down like throughout this period up until 2010, but arrests are still going up for these felony aggravated assaults. And so like what's going on, it's that like the police are treating them more seriously. It's like tough on crime thing is happening among the police officers. And so like the thing that's neat about the data you can see is that like the tough on crime policy like stays even as the crime goes away. So the crime goes down, the crime that like generated the tough on crime policy, but the like all the more these officers and the like we're going to prosecute everything, like that's still going on. And so they turn to like what's around, right? Because they're not going to, you can't just generate like rape arrests, but you can generate, or like homicide cases, but you can generate assaults. Why? Because this is the police department. The police are sitting there, and then people are calling, like there's someone assaulting me, there's someone in the bar doing this. So those are the cases that the police are getting. And so like the attention that the police have, this like tough on crime attention, just shifts to, it's hard to solve burglaries, it's hard to solve car thefts, but we're getting calls from people, every moment about assaults, and so it just shifts to that. And it's like more difficult. You can see why people don't talk about assaults too much, because it's not easy like with drugs. They're like, drug crimes, we shouldn't have been serious on that. Like there's good reasons the system became more serious about assault cases. And I think that's like one of the key lessons of the book is like if you just assume that everyone, like the reason we have mass incarceration is just that people are bad and disingenuous and like try and put people in prison just to put them in prison, right? You're missing a lot of, like there are people like that, so you can find stories like that, but a lot of what's going on, it's not like that. Some of what's going on in the assault story is people starting to care about domestic violence, right? And they didn't used to. And so that's there's nothing wrong with that policy perspective, right? And so you can find all sorts of stuff about police are being re-instructed. Before the 70s, actually you can find police manuals that say, like, when you encounter a domestic violence situation, your job is to mediate, like figure out a way to like do it without a formal arrest. That's like training. That's the police are getting that training. And then the training changes, and the training is now sometimes not just training, sometimes laws that say you must arrest if a domestic violence situation. So it's totally changed, and what has happened? So arrests go way up for domestic violence, and not just domestic, all kinds of arrests, all kinds of assaults, and that's reflected in the data. And so important to see that it's not just drugs, right? It's not just, and we'll talk about this later, but it's not just any one of these things. And some of the things you can understand, like why they were being more severe about this stuff. But this is all to make the point that the kind of mix of cases is changing over this time. And so there used to be just tons of arrests for like drunkenness and disorderly conduct, and that's this bottom left graph. And that was like mostly what police did. And so like my take on what's going on is like police would get called to something, and they wouldn't bother, like it wasn't going to be a court case. So they just arrested the person to make the situation, like diffuse the situation. So they would arrest you for drunkenness, or they arrest you for disorderly conduct. And that case would never get to the prosecutor because they didn't bring that to the prosecutor. And so that used to be a lot of what police did, and those just are dropping off a cliff. Like those kind of arrests are in the data are going away. And what's taking their place is drug arrest and assault arrest, and those are becoming court cases. And so there's this huge shift in like what was going on. You can see it up at the top, where like it used to be that these kind of what I call core criminal justice offenses like rape and murder and burglary and robbery, like stuff like that, is like mostly what is going through the court system. And over time, those are going down, mostly because those crimes are going down. So those cases are going away, but the overall case numbers are the same because they're being replaced with drug cases and assault cases, and that's also replacing like gambling and like stuff like prostitution arrests and stuff like that. And what's important about these new cases that are coming into the system, these assaults and drug cases, they're resulting in people going to prison and going to jail. And that is a change, right? It wasn't happening with drunkenness cases and disorderly conduct cases, and it wasn't even happening with gambling and prostitution cases. It was like this shift to what police can find easily, right? It used to be they could find easily drunkenness and disorderly conduct, but now they can find easily assault cases and drug cases. Other things like DWI, like they're all part of the story that they didn't used to take seriously or didn't used to turn into cases, are now becoming cases, and all of that together, and you can see that in the bottom right graph, right? So while things like burglary are just going down, robberies down, and just staying constant in terms of arrests, drugs goes off the charts, and aggravated assault went high and then stayed high. And so that's like a new mix of cases. What's so important about this is the new mix of cases are easy to prove, and they're easy to find, easy to prove, and easy to win convictions on, especially drug cases. Right, you can find drug cases anywhere you want. Police just go out and start buying drugs, and now they've got someone for sale of drugs, which is treated very seriously. But also assault cases, you can find those all the time because there's people are calling the police. I think mostly what police are doing is reacting to people calling about assaults, and so that's another like thing that the police are just constantly being shown, and then they're going, and now instead of just trying to deal with it informally, they're bringing that to the prosecutors.
Jeff,
Yeah.
are the jurisdictions here, were these places where the prosecutors had discretion about whether or not to like indict someone if the police arrested them? Do you know?
Yes. No. Yes. Yeah. And like that was the norm. Like there was always there's always kind of each inflection point. So one, are the police arresting the people? Two, then do the police bring the cases to the prosecutor? And in both those, you can find data on these have gone up. And then three, are the prosecutors charging the case? And that's another inflection point, assuming they have discretion, which yes, they do. And so and you can find that data also, and I'll show some of this from California, which has good data on this. But the prosecutors, basically, like my take on what happened is the prosecutors just were doing the same thing they always did. No matter what kind of case the police brought them, they were just like treated the same. And that, like in a way, that was problematic, right? Like, because the cases weren't as serious. They were, or let's say this way, like fine if it's a homicide case, like then your prosecutor's office just decide, is there enough evidence to proceed? But if it's a drug case, maybe the prosecutor should have thought not just, can we prove this case? Is there enough evidence that this person is guilty? But maybe they should have thought, is it worthwhile to put the resources into this that we have to for a case? And their answer was basically yes. And so like the percentage of like, the changes that happens, like you don't see a change in prosecutors deciding to prosecute cases. The places you do see this change in like overall convictions, And what I think is it's everyone together becoming more severe, not like some one actor shifting out of tandem with the other. But I have some data on that also. But also, this is like, so just before I get to that, the other thing to just show is like, if you think of, well, basically, what are people in state prison for? It's not a lot of different things. There's like basically these 6 things. For a second, I was worried that I'd misspelled burglary, and this is right from the book, but and kudos to me because it's a hard word to spell, but no, that's right. But you can see the change over time. So like take robbery, for example. In 1980, there's 25% of people in state prison are in there for robbery. By 2019, it's 12. It's like a huge change. And so these are the kind of things, right? Like you can't, it's not like robbery is responsible for mass incarceration. This is the biggest change in the world. But there's like a million of these things, and all of them matter. Yeah.
So what do you say to people who look at this data and say, like, great, top on crime worked. Like, look, these criminal offenses went down. What do you say to them?
Yeah, well, so there's not evidence of that, right? So like what you can see, but it's a great question because this is the question I get from like sophisticated people that aren't demagogues. Will say, well, I'm sympathetic to your argument that we should have less people in prison, but maybe like if we do that, we're going to end up with a lot of more crime. And the reason I fear that, this is the person talking, the reason I fear that is because it does seem like we started putting everyone in prison and then crime went down. Okay, so there is data on this because it's an important question. And so I talk about this in the book. This is another thing, right? If you were writing a popular press book, you would just ignore that because that's awkward. Like, how do you deal with that? Right, but I have to talk about it, and so that's why my book is boring and doesn't have any sales. So, but I think it's the right thing to talk about, right? If you actually want to convince someone. And so there are studies on this, and what they say, and this again, it's like doesn't fit any narrative, is it did decrease crime somewhat to have lots of people in prison, which makes sense, right? Like the more people you put in prison, and you can think of it this way, like it decreased crime outside of prison by having just more people locked up. But the studies suggest like a couple of percentage points, so maybe like 5% of the crime decrease is from that, and then all the rest is from all the other factors. And that's like the real answer to this is like there's some point where if you have like no one in prison and you're just like kind of always letting people out, and like if you go from that to putting what I think of like the people that are committing like over and over really serious crimes, like you start catching those people, and maybe you catch them for drugs, or you catch, who knows what you catch them for, but you start kind of warehousing that person. Crime does go down a little bit, and so that would explain like having some people incarcerated, and so maybe the first steps of mass incarceration, if you go back to the graph, but it doesn't justify kind of all the rest of it. And this is like one of the key things I try to say in the book is there's 2 systems going on, and it's exactly to address this kind of discussion. There's what I call the criminal justice system, and then something called the criminal legal system. And the criminal justice system is what I think of is for cases that are like justicey, right? Like homicides and sexual assaults. I don't say justicey in the book, that's just for you guys. So, but like things where you could say like the person, like what's the government doing? And I'd say like this has to be how you think of it, but you can think of it this way. You can think in these cases, like the Tennessee shooting or something, right? Like the government comes like as a formal response to someone on behalf of a victim to get justice, right? And we want the government to do that instead of letting people just figure out how to do justice by themselves. Because for these kind of cases, I think in our society we currently have, if you just did nothing when like someone murdered your family member, like people wouldn't just be like, oh, well, I guess nothing's gonna happen. I think there'd be a response. And why would there be a response? Like some kind of informal response, because people feel like justice requires that there be a response. So we can have a government that does that, like tries to bring that in so we don't have kind of chaotic vigilante responses, and that is the criminal justice system. So I talk about like homicides, sexual assaults, things like that. We can have a justice system for that. And for those, you can make this kind of argument that we need to have something, and like those are the crimes we really worry about, is we have to have some kind of system that's addressing those. And I don't like, so for me, I don't think it has to be prison, but if you wanted to defend prison, like that's the place that you could do it most effectively. But then there's this whole other part, which is the criminal legal system. And this is what I talk about, the drug cases and the DWIs and gun possession and all this stuff. And what's going on there, it's not the government saying, like, we're coming here to get justice. It's the government saying, we're going to use the system to stop people from doing things, so like a policy. Like, this is the best case scenario. Like, what's the best argument the government can have? It's like, this is how we deter people from carrying guns. We arrest them if they catch them, deter people from DWI and stuff like that. And the answer in that space is, like, now there's no evidence of this like actually working, and this is like where I can call on my here's the criminal justice system, but I have to go ahead for this answer. I can call on my experience in the trenches. Like, this is the trenches part of this. what I know that people don't seem to realize is we actually like catch very few people and prosecute even fewer. Here, oh, this is the best example for this. So this data, like from a city, you get for every 100 robberies in a typical U.S. city, 50 of them will be reported, 15 will result in an arrest, there will be 9 actually charged, 5 people will be convicted of felony, and not all those people will go to prison, right? And so if you're thinking about committing a robbery, and don't tell anyone this, but it's like your worry is not, I'm going to go to prison. That's not what you're worried about. You probably should be more worried about you're going to get shot by this store owner or something like that. And so, like, this is even in the criminal justice space, right? This is why it's not the case that like if we make things more harsh, we stop crime, because we're just so bad at catching everyone, and we've always been bad at it. And it's going to be impossible if you have any kind of like individual freedom. And people say like, oh, well, is this like the technicalities I've heard about? And it's not the technicalities. What it is you can, in America, and like it should be this way, right? The rule is you only can be put in prison for something if you actually did it. And so we have a whole system that's supposed to do that. It doesn't work perfectly.
I'm sorry, where?
Yeah, that's it. That's the principle. That's the principle. So it's like that's the point of the process, right? We're supposed to be trying to figure out if people actually did it. And while it's imperfect, right? Along the way, all these cases are falling out of the system because we can't actually prove that someone did it, right? And so, that and that's this, right? So like all this, and then not just that, but not even get reported. And so it's like the worst possible thing. If you said like worst possible way to try to decrease like robbery and things like that is this system, because of what I have a chapter in the book called The Futility of Stopping Crime, Fighting Crime with Criminal Law, something like that. It's a cool pithy thing. You have to buy the book to find out what the title is, but something along those lines. And that's this last point, and that's why it's so complicated, right? Which is, if you want to defend the system, and you move to this like, well, we're using this to stop people from committing robbery, but you're not actually stopping people. You're just catching a few unlucky people, like the worst robbers, the people who are worst at it, and you're throwing them in prison for a long time. But like, it's just not an effective way to, because guess who knows about this best? The robbers who are like successful, right? They know better than anyone that they can get away with robbery because they're doing it, and by the time they get caught, right, then it's too late. Like they've already committed a whole bunch of robberies and things like that. And so there are ways to try to reduce crime, and I talk about those in the book, but like putting people in prison, not especially good. Let's see where we are. Oh, the last thing, because I feel like I want to leave time for more questions. This is what I was saying about the California data being really good. And so you can see, like, here's really interesting stuff I found in their data about conviction percentage. So if you look on the right, the conviction percentage, and like look at 1975. So there are 48% of felony arrests are leading to conviction, and by 1995, it's 70%. That's a huge change, right, that no one talks about. And so, like, what's going on in this, like, so then I have to kind of theorize, but my suspicion of what's going on is what I talked about, the change in the mix of cases. It's very hard. So in 1975, mostly what's being processed through courts, robbery cases, sexual assault, stuff like that, those are hard cases to prove and win, right? And then 1995, now it's those cases, but those cases have gone down a lot, but mostly what's in there now is drug cases, assault cases. And you say, like, well, assault cases might be hard, but actually, like, solving an assault is actually pretty easy because it's like a bar fight. You see the person right there. Domestic violence, you see who it is. So they're easier than, like, stranger cases like these other cases. And so, this kind of data, and this is what I'd say, like, when you want to convince someone of any of this stuff, you're going to have data like this, because no one's just going to believe me if I say, oh, conviction percentage is harder now than it used to be because of these theories. Like, but if you have data, then, maybe someone will listen to you. And the federal system is the same, but I feel like I'm going too far. So, this is my last thing. This is cool. Yeah, it's everything. Like, so, like, what's the reason for mass incarceration? Like, all these things together. All right. So, and then, if you have questions, I'm here for questions.
Yeah.
Yes, no, thank you guys so much. That was an interesting talk, and I especially like the smart slide ending there. So well. My name is Dean Hitchcock. I'm an MPP from across the street studying public policy. So wanting to dig a little bit more into some of those policy solutions you're talking about.
Okay.
And I've certainly always thought that it seems rather intuitive to me that, like, crime is a product of many things other than bad human behavior, but like economic circumstances, kind of sense of not being connected to a community. And so I've often wondered about, can we say that we're tough on crime by, like, investing in communities as opposed to locking people up?
Yeah, great point. And by the way, when I was doing the talk earlier, I try to remember when I say tough on crime to put quotes up,
Yeah.
and I noticed that I forgot that, so I feel bad, and I'm glad you gave me this chance. Yeah, and it's not actually tough on crime for the reason I said at the end. Like this is a way to be tough on a few people that you catch. And the way I talk about it is like almost like a lottery, right? A reverse lottery, where like especially for you start talking about less severe crimes like drug cases. Like who's getting arrested for selling drugs or using drugs? Like it's such a small percentage of the people that are actually doing these things that it's like losing the lottery and like only one person's the lottery. And so what we did by like taking, well, if you lose the lottery, what changed was it used to be nothing happened to you basically for drug cases, nothing in terms of prison, and then suddenly, yeah, now you're going to go to prison for a long time. So like we changed it for that one person, but just like how we feel, if you change the lottery like amount, like most people still don't even buy a ticket. Like we don't care because we think it's not going to hit for us. And so that's right. It's not really tough on crime, this stuff. And if you really want to be tough on crime, you would figure out like what you're doing. So don't tell the law students there, but like you'd not be focused on law and you'd look somewhere else, right? And stuff like that. But the challenge is it's so hard to figure out like how do we actually like get rid of that stuff. And so the way I think of it is most of it is not law related. So it's not like the penalty's too low and your jurisdiction doesn't have more crime. It's stuff like you're talking about. But if you guys say like, well, which thing is it? It's really complicated. And the most I can add, and so what I try to do is like not just have like, here's my opinion in the book. So I look at studies and there's not a lot of good stuff that says like this works. But there is some stuff that suggests that more policing is like helpful. And the way, but I know that like makes people cringe, but one of the things that this is, like with studies, so I gotta talk about it. And one of the ways I think about it is, and that makes sense, is it's just having someone trying, right? So like it doesn't have to be police, but it's like someone has to have the job of like, how do we stop this crime from happening, right? Like this is a problem. And you think of like any problem, if it was like a disease or if it was an environmental problem, like you'd say, we need some person whose job it is to try to make it happen less. And so right now, it's police, but it doesn't have to be. It could be anybody. So that's the way I try to deal with it in the book, is while there are some studies that suggest that more police kind of decrease the amount of crime, it doesn't have to be police, and it certainly doesn't have to be armed police, and then it doesn't have to be police at all. It could be anyone, like just working on this problem, and then you can come up with other solutions. And I talk about some of the stuff that seems to be promising, like these violence interrupter things, but again, the data on that is a little squishy, so I don't go on. But that's the right way to think about it, is like, if it's not harder laws, like the this question, what is it? And I talk about that in the book. You can't succeed in the reform space by just being like, don't worry about that, let's just let people out, because then people are going to be like, well, no, we care about crime. And some of these crimes we really should care about, right? Like, or maybe all of them, right? And so, that, like I always stress, I'm not saying don't put people in prison for heroin dealing, because I think heroin's great and we should all be on heroin. I'm saying, like, it's just not effective. And I have a thing about, like, the price of heroin is actually, like, dropped throughout all this period. So we're putting all these resources supposedly making it harder to get heroin, and it's actually easier to get heroin than ever was. And so it's just not working. So like, let's do something else, and that's where I would go. But like, the something else would be really helpful. So get on it and figure out what that is. Yeah.
Can you add to that what the legal prescriptive stuff is? Well, I mean, one obvious thing is the parole revocation.
Oh,
but what the book promises to cure is of our addiction.
oh yeah, sure. So you're saying for that part I can do. So what I can't do is necessarily solve
can't fix
crime.
that.
Yeah,
We're not
but I
gonna-
can, and that's what I talk about in the book. Like, so what we can do, and this is again, like, this question is the right question. Like, well, what can I do that like people could generally buy into? And so like the way I talk about that is we can, stop doing things that we started doing in the 70s that led to more incarceration that don't have any of these beneficial effects, right? And so yeah, parole revocation. And like pretrial detention, like these things are like all of which I see as like shortcuts to putting people in jail or prison, right? Like that's the easiest place to look. And so like pretrial detention, where you're not even found guilty yet, parole revocation, where we're not actually going through the process, or you're being put in prison not even for a crime, for like violating some rules. And I talk about this, what I call the criminal legal system. It's like if you said to the prosecutor or the judge about why is this person in prison, they would say they broke the law. We're enforcing the law. And if that's all you've got to like why someone's in prison, then I would say like that needs to go away. So I would be, I think, fine with we'll abolish the entire criminal legal system. Maybe I should have done that for the book pitch. And then and that would get rid of, and I think that would get rid of like drug stuff. And I think so. This makes people uncomfortable when I go past it, but like weapons possession and maybe DWI, like all these things where all we're doing is saying we're going to make people go to prison for DWI. And it's not a ton, but it's actually DWI. There's like so many people that are getting caught for DWI, and they don't go to prison immediately, but they get on probation and then they cycle through. So there's actually a real impact of DWI prosecutions on the incarcerated population. And so all these places where we're saying, what we're doing here is we're putting people in prison to stop everyone from driving drunk. I think all those places, unless you could show me some data, I don't believe you. Like, I think it's not working, and we could try other solutions. But one of the things I have in the book, I don't want to make it so no one wants to buy it, but is there's this cool study on drunk drivers, and they actually did a focus group with them, and they said, like, these people that actually had been caught in New York, and they said, like, well, what, like, are you not going to go drunk drive because now you've known you've been caught? And they're like, are you kidding me? I drunk drove like thousands of times before I got caught. There's no chance I'm going to get caught again. And this is like the thing, we're like deluding ourselves. Like, we think these people don't understand, and we're like, you're going to go to prison if you do this thing. And like, they understand, like, the people that are drunk driving know better than everyone that they're not going to prison when they're drunk driving, and this is not an effective way to stop people from doing it. And so, like, even like, so my colleague Adam Gershwitz, he's like huge on drunk drivers have to go to prison, and like, it's the worst thing ever. And so, like, I'm fine with that. Like, I understand where that's coming from, but what, like, the insight I try to communicate to audiences is, like, there's an argument like that for every crime. Like, you know, maybe you guys think drug crimes are fine, but like, I was dealing with one presentation, and then the person's lighting into me about fentanyl and like this. And, you know, like, yes, like, there's good arguments about why all these things are bad. So if you're going to say, like, we're going to let people out of prison because we're just going to let out the people that aren't doing anything bad, that's like 7 people, right? Like, if you really want to let, like, actually solve mass incarceration, you got to say, even if people are doing things that we don't like, we're just not going to use prison as a solution. We're going to try to address these serious problems, fentanyl, drunk driving, all that stuff, with some other approach, right? Not using jail and prison. And that, to me, is the only way forward. And this kind of saying, oh, it's just this one thing, and we'll just solve that, people are just kidding themselves. Yeah.
Do you offer ideas in the book for sort of increasing the political viability of those changes? Because I think the legal answer, like, so much of it is stop doing the things that we started doing since the 70s. Yeah. But how, like, I think so often Democrats sort of lose the battle just in the way the marketing of the issue is framed, right? So no one wants to be soft on crime. That's not a position you can take. But so how do you shift the dialogue and the framing around what the issues are? Do you have suggestions?
Well, so I think that's, you know, again, like, your guys, this is like the locus of the really good questions. That's a super challenge, right? And you can see that already, right? I think there was a little movement in the Democratic Party to be like more sensitive about mass incarceration, and that is almost like evaporating before our eyes. So, like, New York, people are backtracking, and so, like, I think that's an important question. Like, what is it? And one of the things I think I try to stress in the book is it's not, to me at least, it's not obvious that it's just politicians that are doing this to us. What I see when I talk to people is Americans, like, kind of buy into this. And so you talk to someone who's like very progressive, but they'll say, but on this crime, like, people need to go to prison. And so there's something about, like, the American psyche, which is like, we accept this idea that, like, if we really care about something, we send people to prison when they do that thing. And I think that has to change. Otherwise, the political problem is always going to persist. If you have a choice between the person who's like tougher, and you just see yourself as like, well, I'm not going to commit the one crime I care about, but I want to make sure people go to prison. The tough person seems better to you if you really care about that thing. And so it creates this political advantage, which is why the Democrats, who are not fools, like, made that change. I don't mean that generally statement, but in the time when they were deciding this, like, they were not making this change just to make the change. They were doing polling and figuring out the change happened. So, like, what, and then to your question, like, and this may be naive, but, like, my thought is, like, the only way to do this is to break this link between this kind of the question about is it tough on crime to put people in prison, to kind of get in between that. So yeah, we're tough on crime, but we're doing it in a way that's not sending people to prison. Like, that's the weak spot, and like how to get that message through. Like, one would be, well, and this is part of what I said, like, I'm very conscious that I'm not a political expert. But, like, one thing is to have books like this that say, like, well, this is not an effective way to solve these crimes, and to talk about, like, all the cases we're not actually catching and all that stuff, and just have that kind of start saturating the world, because I think it's actually not just politicians, it's like the voters who think these things. And so we have to kind of slowly get this message out. And so, like what I would say is the solution is to convince people to buy and read this book, right? That's the first step when you're going. But I also think like that's why I say like it's important to just be honest about the complexity of it and how hard it's going to be to start changing what I think people's minds generally, and then that hopefully will cause the politicians. Because I have no faith that if it's popular with the people, that politicians would just say like, well, no, there's a few people like Cory Booker as an example. Like he seems to say things that really, like I'm sure his consultants say like, don't say this, it hurts your chances. But he like stands out because he's the only one that's saying that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thanks for being here, professors. I'm a big fan of your evidence textbooks. I had a second year last year. I had a question about what you were talking about with deterrence. And I'm like very inclined to agree with what you're saying. How would you respond to people who say that like that initial 100 robberies, if people didn't know about the penalty, that initial number, there's like another 100 people that are deterred from doing the robbery at all?
Yeah. Well, so this is what I was saying. I mean, there is some evidence that like some severity and some toughness, right, deters some crime, and that makes sense. Like that has to be true. There has to be like some amount. Like if it's at all possible that you could go to prison for something, you're probably like just generally across the population, there's gonna be less people doing it. I think that's right. And so all we're really saying is like once it's clearly illegal to commit a robbery, and if you're like caught doing it, it'll be inconvenient. Like you won't make your next appointment, right? You'll have to like get arrested, you'll be booked through and stuff like that. And so the real question for me is like, well, what does adding some prison term do anything helpful for that? And I think like to me, like that's the question I have to answer, and I don't see the evidence of that. Like it's not. So if you you could think of it this way, you could like if the robbery suspect has to serve like a month basically going through the process, and before they even, because that's just like pre-trial and going through, like that's enough. Like that deterrent stops most people. That's enough deterrent for most robberies because it's not that good a career to commit robberies and all that stuff. And so like beyond that, I don't think there's any value in it. So I think you're right. Like it does. It's like, and this is why I wouldn't say make robbery legal. And I don't even know that like for any of these things you have to do that. Like heroin sales and stuff, you could still like severely regulate all these things so that if you got caught doing these things, you wouldn't be able to get like a job and like all that stuff. Like things would happen to you because it's illegal. And so I think you're right that like there is some value in things being illegal and some symbolic value in things being legal. And like all I'm saying is the value of putting people in prison, especially for any extended period of time, is not there. Like that's the part that is weakest. Oh, Ben, I think you're right.
So I guess one of the things I think about a lot is, we're not actually determining guilt all that often because nobody's going to trial because you can get charged in such a way that it just doesn't make any rational sense to go to trial.
Yeah.
So to what extent does you're not allowed to plead guilty anymore, not like work practically, but in terms of reducing mass incarceration?
Oh, so that's like your suggestion of a reform would be no more guilty pleas.
Yeah.
No plea bargaining. Yeah, I actually
in
heard
a
this.
different planet than the one we live on now.
Yeah, no, like I like it. I like this question because I've written a separate article about plea bargaining. I'll send it to you. And I actually think that would. So people think this is a real thing, and I say I should be fair and say like most people doing this presentation would be like, great idea. That will cause the system to come to a halt, and no one will go to prison. I think what will happen is the system would adjust. Like the system is cleverer than we think, and the system would adjust. And basically, if you got rid of plea bargaining, there would be people just pleading guilty straight to the indictments and things that would make up a lot of that. So you'd end up with like severe, like it would just be like, please judge, go easy on me because I pled guilty. And that's obviously like depending on your jurisdiction, there's things where you wouldn't plead guilty. There's a mandatory sense that the judge couldn't go hard on you. But I think like that kind of, these solutions that are just like, we'll do something that will like cause the system to crash, and that will be that will like.
No, I'm saying you
Yeah.
can't plead guilty. Period.
Fine. So then what happens? Everyone just goes. So they would just like wherever jurisdiction you're in, they would like send judges, and they would figure out like these very short trials or something. They would do something, and that would like solve the problem. And the reason I think this is because like basically these types of solutions are designed to avoid like, so the legislature won't do this, so we'll like force them to do it by kind of messing up their system in other ways. And I think if you can't get the legislature on board in the first place, then you'll have, like, they'll figure out a way to defeat you. And you're right, like, that's pretty strong. Like, so we say you can't plead guilty at all, everyone has to go to trial. There'd be like, in theory, you could have, the prosecutor have dismissed lots of cases, and so you'd have that thing. But I think they would still go forward on all the severe cases. Those cases would be getting hammered even harder. And then one of the things I say about this, it might even be in the book, is that it would be unpredictable in like which cases would end up surviving and which would be getting dismissed. And you might get, this is one of the insights in the book, the easiest cases would survive. And so that would be the drug cases and the cases against the most vulnerable people. And like the case against Trump, like that would go away because that's going to take tons of effort and stuff like that. But it's, I mean, yeah, there's people that suggested stuff like that.
No, I mean, this is not I just was wondering what you, like,
Or like a question could be like, how much is plea bargaining responsible for mass incarceration? I certainly think like it's something that's like making mass incarceration work, but I think if you took it away, mass incarceration could figure out a workaround.
We're over time, but come on up if you want to ask more questions, and thank you so much.
Yeah, this is delightful, thank you.